Hey guys, and welcome back to the podcast. Really excited to be joined by Steve Flink, and we're going to be talking all things US Open. Steve, how you doing?
Good, Faizan. It's good to be with you, and looking forward to recapping the Open. It was a good fortnight this year. Enjoyed it. As always, exhausting and exhilarating at the same time.
I can imagine. Well, thank you for jumping on. Obviously, we connected at Wimbledon. It was great to chat to you in person, and it'll be great to have a chat now as well. How was it at the US Open? Obviously, you were there as well. So how did you find it, the experience being there as media, and what did it seem like the atmosphere was like?
Yeah, we've had Opens in the past where there was a little bit more scorching weather. We had a bit of that in the first week, and it did toward the end. The temperature went back down to the 70s Fahrenheit. It was pleasant. There wasn't much rain. A lot of good matches. A couple of times we spilled over from the afternoon evening sessions with long matches in the afternoon. I always feel terrible for the fans when that happens. Obviously, the organizers, it's hard for them to anticipate that. They only put 2 matches, as you know, in the stadium now, in Arthur Ashe Stadium in the day session, although they start at noon rather than 11 a.m. as they did in the past. So there were a couple of issues with that. But by and large, I think it all went very smoothly. And obviously, having the 2 Americans in the finals, Pegula and Fritz, really added a lot of positive feelings, because the public have been waiting for that for so long, particularly in the case of Fritz, in the men, because Roddick was the last American man in 2006 to be in the final. He was the last American man to win it in 2003, and he was even the last American man to make a Grand Slam final anywhere at Wimbledon in 2009. So this has been a long time coming. I think that certainly made this Open a bit different from any of the last 14 or 15.
Yeah, 100%. It was great to see 2 Americans in the final in their home slam, and I think it was a record attendance from what I've seen at the US Open, which is great, because obviously there's been a bit of talk about other sports, and obviously Novak at Wimbledon was talking about pickleball and paddle coming in, and tennis needs to really pick up its game. But this is a really positive sign, I think, trending towards the right direction.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, it's a tough balance, because they I don't know exactly how many grounds passes they sell, but you take those people on top of all the ticket holders, and when you're making your way over from Arthur Ashe Stadium to Louis Armstrong Stadium, it can be very, very crowded. That's the only drawback, is that there are times when it's like getting stuck in a traffic jam, because that's just a lot of people to accommodate. But I guess it's a nice problem to have, because you do want to have these great crowds, and hopefully that'll continue in the years to come. I want to see the crowds become more and more educated too. It's hard to know how many of these people are just general sports fans out there for an entertainment event at the US Open who don't know tennis, versus those that really are immersed in the sport.
100%. I also tend to have the same sentiment on that, because I do sometimes think that when there's people in the stadium, it's always good to have some people who are new fans, of course, and they want to get into sport, but we want people to be there because they want to watch the tennis rather than just the event. And I think it's a mix of that. So it's good to have people getting involved who want to actually learn, get educated, as you said, into the sport, which is always a positive thing. And also, like they said after the final, go and pick up a racket and go and play, right? And that's fantastic as well. So it's good that they're trying to push that as well in America, given there's so many other major sports there. So definitely a fantastic thing, I think, anyway, personally. On the 2 finals, then I want to ask you about the Sinner-Fritz final, which I think for some people potentially went the way they were expecting, but for others, maybe Fritz put up a better fight, or maybe he didn't do as well as they expected. But I thought it was a pretty entertaining straight set victory. You don't normally say that, but there were some interesting moments. What are your thoughts on the final and how it played out?
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. I mean, because in the opening, so just look at how it all unfolded. In the first set, Sinner had the quick break, and you're thinking, oh boy, here we go. The favorite is blazing, and he's going to take control quickly. But then Fritz broke back, so he went from love 2 to 3-2 on serve before Sinner ran out the set on the last 4 games. So he ended up breaking Fritz 3 times, but it was an interesting set in the sense that Fritz did work his way back into it. Then Fritz served much better in the second set, barely losing points on his serve up until he served at 4-5. And then I just had that feeling, I think a lot of us did in the press section. That's where you sense, this is a tough moment for Fritz because he's serving to stay in the set. Sure, he's had nothing but easy holds until now, but Sinner's going to pounce, and that's exactly what he did. And he broke him there to go up 2 sets. And Fritz would have had every right to be a bit demoralized there. That's the last thing you want, to serve as well as he did throughout the set and then get broken at the end and have the penalty being down 2 sets was a tough moment for him. But then once again, he really went to work. And in the 3rd set, this is where your point is well taken. For an interesting match, despite being straight sets, Fritz was down a couple of break points at 2-3. It could have been over there. He got very aggressive the rest of that game, and he hit some spectacular winners and took the initiative and got the crowd more involved, and then broke Sinner in the next game, held again. So he went from 2-3 to 5-3, and you thought, okay, we're going to go 4. But Sinner told us what a great champion he is, the way he ran out the way he won those 4 games in a row at the end, deciding that, no, I'm not conceding this set. I'll make him serve it out. He played a very good game. Taylor got 2 points away from winning the set. Sinner simply wouldn't let him have it. And I felt like it was entertaining. And at least Fritz, he got actually better each set, you could argue, from being the 3 breaks against him in the first set to just 1 break at the end of the second to going up a break and serving for the 3rd set. So, yeah, I thought he gave a decent account of himself. And I thought Sinner to me played far and away his best match of the tournament. And I was happy to see that too, because he's such a great player. And this was the kind of tennis, Faizan, that we saw from him really late last year when he beat Djokovic, 2 out of 3 times in an interesting 10, 11 day span, and won the Davis Cup for Italy almost single-handedly, and got to the final in Turin in the year-end championships where Djokovic did beat him. And I feel like that carried over to the Australian Open. He won his first major. Then we know what happened thereafter. There were some more wins. There was Miami. There was the final of Indian Wells. But little did we know he was carrying around this whole trauma of having tested positive. And he knew it. We didn't know it. So for him to find that out on the eve of the Open and have it go public the eve of the Open and then play this kind of tennis, I thought it was nice to see, because I believe he's a fundamentally honest guy, and we don't have to get into all the issues surrounding that case. But I thought he was made. The process didn't do him. The process just really didn't do him justice. That was the problem. He had a lot of baggage to carry. It was hard for him to have to play under those circumstances, but he seemed to get better as the tournament progressed, and I thought that final round was really a peak performance from him. 2nd major of the year. He's now in the driver's seat to end the year at number 1, and I feel like he deserves it. He has been the best player, and despite what happened in the middle of the season, where he didn't play terribly, he was in the semis of the French, he was in the quarters of Wimbledon, but I didn't feel like we saw the best Sinner in the loss to Alcaraz, despite the fact that it went 5. We certainly didn't see the best Sinner in the loss to Medvedev at Wimbledon, even though that went 5. So I feel like it was kind of a fitting conclusion of the Grand Slam season, in the sense that Djokovic and Alcaraz both of them were a bit spent coming in, understandably, after the Olympics. They didn't perform their best. And that in the end, Sinner picked up the pieces and put this episode behind him, at least for now, on the steroid charges and all of the controversy reaction to it, and really peaked for the last major of the year and peaked for the final of the last major. So I thought that was all very, very fitting.
Yeah, 100%. I think he was very mentally strong, right? I was questioning how he would potentially handle the case going into the US Open. Would it affect him on court? And when he lost the first set in that first round match against McDonald with the crowd behind McDonald, right, you think, maybe, even though, in terms of the gap in level, you think he makes it through quite comfortably, but you just don't know how he's feeling mentally, and that can translate so easily into his game on court. So it was great to see him just put that behind him, get that first out of the way, maybe a bit of nerves, and then it was business as usual. And I don't think he played his best tennis throughout the tournament, but I like to say that it's similar to what we would sometimes say about Djokovic, where he would win Grand Slams and he'd say, you know what, I don't think he actually played his best level. He maybe played a B, maybe his B level, but it was enough because he played really well in the big moments and he got through matches, and that's what the great players do. And I felt like that's what Sinner did as well, because if you watched when I was watching the Jack Draper match, and like you said in that final against Fritz, when he turned it on when he was 4-5 down, he did a similar thing in the tiebreaker in that second set against Draper, where Draper played some really good tennis, managed to match him within the tiebreaker. He just upped it a level and took that tiebreaker quite comfortably. So I think that was really good to see from Sinner, that he was able to mentally kind of push through that, and also he's got this maturity about him where he knows when to turn it on, when it's really critical to kind of go into lockdown mode and play his best tennis. So that was great to see as well. If I was to ask you,
I just want to comment. You summed it up well. I would say the Mackenzie McDonald match was a bit of an anomaly. Yeah, he got it. Maybe his mind was still reeling then from all the reaction to the news, and who knows exactly what it was. And he really played a bad first set, and then got down the early break in the second. But then he blitzed through the rest of that match, and the rest of the matches were pretty straightforward. I would say against Tommy Paul, he got himself in a bit of trouble because it was an evening crowd in Ash Stadium, and they were a festive atmosphere. Tommy Paul is very popular in this country. There were a lot of things that happened. And even then, though, down 4-1, down 2 breaks, 4-1 first set, didn't give up on that set. Came back very nicely. I thought Tommy should have probably had enough to close that set out with a cushion of 2 breaks, but he didn't. And Sinner wins it in a breaker, and then wins, another breaker in the second set and wins in straight. Didn't play his best, but I thought he played very well. And then we saw him in the 4-setter against Medvedev, where, aside from that, second set I thought was less his fault than the fact that Medvedev really raised his game in the second set. Medvedev played a great second set, and but Sinner got right back on the beam early in the third. A strange match because all those one-sided sets, but he closed it out in 4. And Draper match, I didn't like the way he played, by the way. I felt like but I think that was an awkward matchup. Draper's no fun for anybody to play. Lefty, very heavy spin on his forehand, wicked slice serve in the ad court. There's so many things that Draper does well, and he uses his leftiness to the hilt. So, and it's not that comfortable. It wasn't that comfortable for Sinner from the backcourt. I thought it would be more so. He didn't look that comfortable in the rallies. Eventually, he was better on the big points, and he got through that. But that's what impressed me, is that he came off all of those experiences and was able to put it all together so much on his terms and with such inspiration in the final, knowing he's playing an American. So if it had gotten closer, it could have gotten a bit tense because they were thirsting for Fritz to win, that crowd. And Sinner he was so composed and hitting out, swinging so freely. That's what impressed me, that he found it in the final. And to me, it was better than anything I saw from him in the 6 previous matches. Better by far.
Yeah, I agree. So if I was to ask you, Steve, because he was asked this after the final, if you were to take the version of Sinner that won the US Open and you put him up against the version of Sinner that won the Australian Open, who would you say would win?
Well, that's a close call. I would have said that maybe the version of Sinner at the end of 2023 might have been a bit better than this one. But the Sinner in Australia, let's not forget, he was on the brink against Medvedev in the final. Now, if you take the tournament in its entirety, I thought he was better in Australia. In its entirety, the way he was blitzing through most of his matches. And but then in the final, he's down 2 sets to love, and he had to work his way back, and it was gritty, and he showed a lot of gumption, and it was courageous, but that wasn't necessarily his best tennis in the final. But the tournament overall, yes, I would have maybe taken that player, but only slightly. I think he was getting closer and closer back to the Sinner of the end of 23 and the start of 24, and it was very impressive. It was very impressive. And he was honest afterwards that, he still doesn't feel he's put that episode behind him. He knows that it's still still on his mind, but obviously he put it more in a back compartment. And I thought that again, it's commendable because it was a lot to deal with. There was different reaction from the players, and people were so stunned. And I think some of them tried to compare. Some people tried to compare it maybe to the other cases with Sharapova and with Halep, and it seemed like maybe and talked about better treatment and how he as a player of fame and fortune had an advantage to be able to hire lawyers. I feel like he took it on the chin a bit more than he deserved, given that it was not his. I don't think it was his fault. I think it was his team's fault, and he remedied that by firing the physio, the two guys, including the physiotherapist. And so I feel like that was a big burden. And by the final, I think he wouldn't allow himself to think much of that. His mind was on winning the title, and he reaffirmed that for this year at least, he was the best player in the world. Carlos was brilliant in the middle of the year, winning two majors back to back in Roland Garros and Wimbledon, but Carlos was much more up and down, and obviously lost early here and got blitzed by Zverev in the Australian Open at the start of the year in the quarters in 4 sets. So I feel like Sinner, he was the most solid player, and obviously Novak was very distracted at various stages of this year, and he got what he wanted the most by winning the gold medal at the Olympics. But I don't think Novak was really ever thinking about number one this year. I think he was hoping he'd win a slam somewhere along the line in addition to the Olympics, and was hoping he'd find the inspiration in New York to follow up on what he did in Paris, but he didn't. He just didn't have that in him. So to me, I guess you add all those elements together, and I feel like it was fitting and that Sinner would be the one to come away with the top honor in New York. That made sense.
What do you think, Steve? Has Sinner improved since that 2023 version, right? So you said towards the back end of the year, he shifted, right, in terms of mentality and potentially also his game as well. And I'm sure there were some incremental improvements up until that time. But what do you think have been the big differences tactically or even technically as well with his game that's made him such a formidable force this year? I think he's got a win percentage over 90% this year. Obviously, two slams, and he's been phenomenal. Right. So what's been the difference, do you think?
Oh, I think it's hard to put your finger on any one thing. I just think his game, he kind of solidified his game. I feel like over the course of time there, post Wimbledon 23 up until the end of last year into early year, the serve improved decidedly. He became much harder to break, and he became much tougher on break points, at bailing himself out from break point down. I feel like the serve became much more of an anchor for his game. And then he just made minor modifications to me from the backcourt. He didn't have to improve that much. I'd say his forehand became more consistent. I felt that there were times, even when he lost to Djokovic in the semis of Wimbledon in 23, where his forehand let him down. He could make surprising errors in important moments. But I think all of that. He just improved the whole package, but most markedly, his serve got better, in my view. And he now has, by the way, to me, I think he's got one of the better second serves out there. That impressed me a lot at the Open. I mean, when he was serving at 4-5 against Tommy Paul in the second set tiebreak, in danger of the match becoming one set all, he came up with a couple of good second serves. Tommy wanted to attack them. Tommy was looking to pressure him. He couldn't do it. And that's a credit. And at a juncture like that, with so much on the line, to hit 2 second serves like that. Overall, I just think his second serve is much less attackable. His first serve is much more pinpoint accuracy and reliability. So I look to the serve and just a few things off the ground that are slightly better, but I think he already was great off the ground. And his movement just gets better and better. I mean, that's training, that's professionalism, that's dedication to his craft. There are a lot of factors involved in that, but all of those things. I think that the bottom line is he already was an awfully good player who had turned into a great champion.
Yeah. And pinpoint is actually a very fitting word for his serve, Steve, as well, because obviously he changed his action from platform to pinpoint. So it's actually a pretty fitting word for for his serve. He actually remodeled it. I think it was midway through last year, actually, when he remodeled it. And you made a really good point about breakpoint save, because he's actually saved 73% of breakpoints over the last 52 weeks. So I think he's joint top with Matteo Berrettini. So it just shows how good he's been in the real crunch moments and those clinical points as well. On Jannik Sinner, is there anything else you want to touch upon in terms of his year and also the US Open before we move on to talk about some of the other players and moments for the men's side?
No. I think, look, I just think it was a great year. Might have been even greater if he hadn't have been preoccupied with things off the court like that, and explains to us some of the what seemed like slightly uneven performances that we thought might have been related to his hip or being sick before the French Open, all those other things. But obviously all of this was connected. And I feel like we didn't see, well, we did after Australia, but starting with, say, Indian Wells, he did come back in Miami, but then we saw the clay court lost with the loss of Tsitsipas, putting it all together. And then obviously the abbreviated clay court campaign and the eventual loss to Carlos in Roland Garros. I look at all that, and that was not the same, quite as consistent, despite the winning percentage you mentioned earlier, that 90%. He wasn't quite as formidable through that period. Now I think it all sort of adds up. There's more clarity to what happened. But I feel like if we want to look at this season, it's a pretty phenomenal season. Guy had never won a major heading into 2024. He wins the first and last major, so obviously establishes himself as the by far and away the premier hardcore player, but also just the best player of all. The only place he didn't really reap many rewards, because he did win a grass court title, was on the clay. And that was understandable because it was all disrupted for him after he got hurt in Monte Carlo. So I just think you look at the whole picture, and he can't be very disappointed. And I think, frankly, I expect him to add a title or two. I expect him to do some decent things before the year's out. He's got the number one ranking virtually locked up. But it turns into a great season for him and sets the stage for a really interesting 2025 to see what he can do to follow up, to see what he does against Carlos. There's so many things to look at, because let's face it, one of the only things he won't like about this year so far, and not on a personal vengeful level, but just professionally, is that he lost to Carlos after a lopsided 6-1 first set in Indian Wells. He lost that final. And then he had a pretty easy first set at the French Open and a 2-love lead in the second, and lost that set, won the third, and went down in 5 to Carlos there. So both of those matches, despite how well Carlos played to win them and earn them, will probably disappoint Sinner looking back. That's his premier rival, and he lost 2 very big matches to him. Then didn't get another crack at Alcaraz. Maybe they'll play in the fall. So that's maybe the only negative to the season, but it's not a terrible negative. It's just something that would, in terms of the rivalry, I think where he would like to reassert himself. He had been 4-3 in that rivalry. Now he's down 5-4. It's been a great series. And I think in his mind, he believes at the very least he should be splitting matches with Alcaraz, and he probably believes he should win more than he loses. That's the all top players believe that. So I think that to me is the only thing, looking back on the year, when you ask about Sinner, that could nag at him.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the only, as you said, a small blemish is that rivalry with Alcaraz this year, and only the 2 times they played. They've actually, interestingly, never played a Grand Slam final yet, which is interesting given both have, combined, they've won 6 Grand Slams now. So I'm very interested to see in 2025 if we do get a final between the 2 and what that might look like, because obviously it just brings an added element to it.
It does. You're right. I mean, the French was very close at being a semi, but you're right. There's a different, the title is right there on the line. Carlos thus far Jannik hasn't had as many appearances. We didn't see this last year. It was a breakthrough semifinal at Wimbledon, and then we had the breakthrough win in Australia, and here in between he didn't make the finals. So he's shown that he can rise to the occasion. Hasn't lost one of those big finals, and Carlos has done it 4 times. So they both have shown that they know how to they can rise to the occasion and produce their best, or produce enough to win in a Grand Slam final. That's what would make it interesting if they happen to meet in the Australian final. That would be the next step for them. It's inevitable. Let's face it, they're going to play many major finals. That pretty soon. Especially with Novak not really at this stage. I don't know how much he'll play next year, so I don't know where his ranking will go. But most likely, most of the time, these two will be 1 and 2. It's a little complicated right now. Zverev is second in the points in the race. So, which just shows you, that's all about winning a lot of matches, because Zverev, yes, he got to the final of the French and almost had Alcaraz. He was 2-1 up. But I got to believe he's looking back on the campaign a bit disappointed. You win that many matches and go that far in so many tournaments and take some titles and win Rome and all of that, but you didn't come away with one of the premier prizes. And there's no way. I mean, I don't want to be disrespectful of him, but he's not the second best player in the world. That's misleading. That's quantity over quality to me for Sasha Zverev to be second in the points. So what I'm saying is eventually you're going to see pretty soon, I think, that there'll be a long period, I suspect, even though Carlos has his ups and downs, he wins a lot of titles. Sinner obviously does. That where the only time they'll be able to play at a certain point will be in the final. So those major finals will come about for sure.
Yeah, exactly. You make a really good point on that. Well, we can talk about Zverev because you're just talking about him. And I mean, how much of a missed opportunity was it, Steve, for him, given how the draw opened up? And I guess Taylor Fritz, which we'll touch upon him as well a bit later, but he made the final, and I'm sure Zverev will look back at the US Open and think this is a really big opportunity for me to be in the final against Sinner, because his half of the draw didn't look too bad. And obviously making a final of Roland Garros as well. It's been, you'd say, a long time coming for him. He's now, you would argue, in the peak of his career. And he still hasn't won a slam. And he was seen at the age of 18, 19 as being almost, I feel like he was being touted, and you can correct me, as if he was going to achieve what someone like an Alcaraz has achieved now, but it didn't quite happen, and he obviously coincided with the big three. So, I mean, what do you think of his performance at the US Open, and just generally as well, how his career is trending right now?
No, in one sense, you have to pat him on the back for considering what happened in that awful injury against Rafa a couple of years ago at the French. The way he worked his way back, the level that he's played at all year has been high, but I find him disappointing because he's got so much physical ability. He moves so well for a big man. He's got arguably, you could put his first serve right up there. As you could argue, he has the best first serve in the game. Although I feel like he's too determined to get that super high percentage, around 80% first serves, instead of, I'm going to go for more aces. I don't care if it goes down to 65, 66%. I want more free points, more aces, which he could serve. That's a different debate. But I'm just saying he has a great serve. He's not serving doubles and clusters the way he used to. I still feel he plays too defensively. I noticed it particularly in this Fritz match. Far too much time way behind the baseline trying to defend when he doesn't have to, and trying to rely on that reach and that strength and beating people more with defense than with offense. I don't quite understand that, given his ability to be aggressive. And I thought when he beat Alcaraz in Australia, he was very aggressive, particularly the first two sets. He was really flattening his forehand out. I like watching him play that way more. But leave all that aside. That's just a little technical assessment. Here's what I mean. The guy goes from being a set away from the Australian Open final. He's got Medvedev down 2-0, and that one gets away. That's obviously a big disappointment. He'd beaten Alcaraz. He would have had a decent chance against Sinner in the final. I still would have favored Sinner, but it would have been a great final probably. And then in Roland Garros does a great job. Has to play Rafa in the first round, gets to the final, makes a big comeback from 2-5 down in the third to beat Alcaraz and go up 2-1, and then in about 5 minutes, he's down 4-love in the fourth set. It was very disappointing to me, and didn't play a good fifth either, taking nothing away from Alcaraz, who has shown us what a great big point pressure player he is, and how he doesn't give up on himself. But I thought for the last two sets from Zverev's end were disappointing, given what was on the line there? What was at stake? I didn't. He said his legs went. Maybe so, but I just thought, look, you got to suck it up at times like that when there's a big prize on the line and you have a chance to win your first major. Goes to Wimbledon, got hurt. I know he was nursing an injury there. I guess it happened against Norrie, but even so, you're up 2 sets against Fritz on the center court. Can't close him out. All right. Didn't have a good Olympics, but that put him in a better position to come to the Open and do well, and the chance to avenge the loss to Fritz. And Taylor once more beats him, this time in 4 sets, with the first in 4 sets being tie breaks that Fritz outplayed him significantly in. So I look at all that and I say, okay, a very consistent, solid year, but so many big matches, including the Sinner semifinal in Cincinnati, so many big matches that I think he could win that he somehow does not win. And I don't get the feeling, and I could be wrong, that these losses sting. They don't seem to sting as much for him as they do other top players. I could be wrong. It may be a bit of a superficial reaction to how he reacts on the court or what he says in the press conference afterwards. But I'd like to see him be a bit harder on himself and demand it of himself, because there'll come a point it's not going to get any easier. It's not going to get any easier. Sinner's going to keep improving. Alcaraz is going to keep improving. Novak's not gone yet. And we've seen that these really first-rate players, the likes of Taylor Fritz, are not afraid of him. So those matches are not givens either. He loses 2 majors in a row to Fritz. So it's like, okay, is he really going to win a major? And then I say the same thing about Medvedev. Will he win another major? They're not going to have any easy time of it. And so I'm a little worried about Zverev, and I think it's more regrettable in his case. Medvedev at least got one. If he never wins another, at least he had that one U.S. Open. But Sasha still hasn't done it, and we know that he wasted a 2-set lead in a breakup against Thiem in the 2020 Open final. He served for the match in the 5th set, 2 points away in the tiebreak in the 5th. All these near misses. And I know I was told by people that were around him after that Open final in 2020, he was devastated by that. I would have hoped that would have eventually led to him to sort of find a way to bring this out of himself. Because yes, he plays too defensively, but that's not the whole story. To me, it's more about what's going on with his mindset and how he's preparing for these big matches. So to me, it's another, wherever he ends up in the rankings, I don't care if he ends up 2 in the world this year somehow by having a couple of good tournaments in the autumn and maybe doing well in the Masters 1000 event in Paris and a good Turin. I just will not, none of us will think of him as the second best player in the world for this year when you look at what Sinner and Alcaraz did, and even what Djokovic did to win the Olympics. So it's, to me, he's disappointing, and I can't quite figure Sasha out. That's my bottom line.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's with a mental block in some of the big matches, and I'm unsure exactly why. And maybe it's happened to him a few times in the past, and it's been a cumulative effect. And I just don't feel like he's able to push over that line. And as you say, I do think it's going to get harder and harder for him the longer he doesn't win a slam as well. Yeah,
you're right. And he looks up at his father and looks so vulnerable, and so he's just missed shots. He'll miss a routine 2-hander or the forehand, which is the more vulnerable side. Will go for a couple of games in a big match, and he's looking up at his dad as if to say, how can this be happening? So he cares, and he's frustrated, and he's very professional in his way, but somehow I just don't want him to come away from this year satisfied. No matter what he does at the end of the year, he should say to himself, look, you were 1 set away from the Australian. You had Medvedev down 2 sets and you didn't put him away. You were 1 set away from winning the French. You had Fritz 2 sets to love at Wimbledon, and then you lost to Taylor again because you didn't play well enough in the 2 tiebreaks at the U.S. Open. So it's in terms of the 4 majors, it's not what he should be satisfied with. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I also agree with your assessment on his game as well. I do think at times he can play too cautious. He'll go for the very, let's say, safe option of going cross court a lot, especially with the forehand. It can tend to be a bit loopy and not really penetrate through the court. And as you say, when he beat Alcaraz, he was very penetrating with that forehand, flattened it out. Especially on hard courts, he's such. I mean, let's be honest, he's a big guy. He's got power, and he's also able to defend well. he should be using the weapons at his disposal, and no one's asking him to come out and play super aggressive tennis. But at the same time, I think when he's proactive and trying to move forward and transition, I think that's when he's at his best. And when he has like a clear, decisive attacking game plan in place. So, as you say, that was weird to see him against Fritz sometimes playing 2-3 meters behind the baseline in neutral rallies. And you just think, why does he need to be that far back? I don't feel like he's, it's strange.
Yeah, he doesn't. And he, I don't understand it. I don't know whether in the back of his mind, he's thinking, okay, when I try to go flatter on the forehand, I hit a lot of winners, but I don't want to I can make some costly errors. And he's a little afraid of that happening. Maybe that's part of it, but I don't think he should be. I think his attitude, I'd be, okay, I maybe will make a few more unforced errors, but I'm going to do so much more damage if I hit out more freely and hit the forehand a bit flatter. And I know I can count on my backhand, which is one of the best in the game. So why not take a few more risks with my forehand, but let these guys know I'm going to be the aggressor. And he doesn't seem to want to do that consistently. And I never saw it more clearly than to be sitting there down pretty low on the court in the press seats at the U.S. Open watching that match with Fritz. You see it more clearly from that setting than you do on television. And it really struck home to me that day. And Taylor, to his credit, Taylor's stepping up on the baseline, and he knows that his forehand can go at times too. But his attitude is, no, this is for me. I'm going to set the tone here. I'm going to dictate, and I don't care if I spray a few forehands. I'm going to keep him on his heels. And all credit to Fritz. He played that match the right way.
Yeah, agreed. On Taylor Fritz, I mean, how impressive was he this campaign, Steve, at the US Open? A breakthrough tournament and potentially a catalyst as well for the rest of his career as well. I mean, how good did he look? And obviously, as you said, you're watching in the press, so you saw him up close.
He looked very good, but I also thought it was a fascinating comment he made after the final, that he felt like he never played. In his mind, he said, I never played out of my mind. In his mind, he thought he played well, but that he could have played better, and that he was using that as a positive. Like, if I can do all this, make the finals of the U.S. Open and not feel I did it playing my best tennis, then, I think that was his way of saying, then maybe I can win one of these things. Yeah. I don't know whether he can. I wouldn't bet either way, whether he wins a major or doesn't, but I think we will. I don't think we'll see him stuck in the quarterfinal syndrome any longer. I think we will see him get to some semis and finals. I was impressed, though. I was impressed with the composure, the competitiveness, the mental toughness. He did a lot of things the Tiafoe match could have gotten away from. I think that would have been very disconcerting to him. Not that he doesn't respect Francis, but he had 3-love lead in the first set and lost 6 or 7 games. That one really got away from him. Fought hard to win the second. Got broken at the start of the third in a pretty sloppy game and eventually lost that, and then came back. He showed his fitness and his fortitude in the fourth set and took advantage of that one bad game from Francis at 4-5 in the third when he had 40-15 and double faulted twice, and Taylor grabbed the break. And I'd say that, and then he was very strong in the fifth, and obviously Tiafoe was whatever was going on there with anxiety, cramping, just fading out physically. All those things were happening simultaneously. But Fritz, it was a clutch win, regardless. He found a way to win the 4 set. Francis was still strong enough to win it in 4 and couldn't. And so I look at that. I look at the way he played in those breakers against Zverev. So and the tournament as a whole, and he came back against Ruud. Ruud played very well against him in the first set. He came back to win that in 4. So he had to beat a lot of good players. Berrettini he beat as well. I know he owns Berrettini, but still, that was not the simplest of draws, and he dealt with it well. And I would agree with him, though. I didn't think he played out of his mind, but he did play very, very well and competed well. I'm curious to see what he can do with it. I mean, Fritz is a hard worker, and he's a realist, and he demands a lot of himself, but he's a good thinker too. When you hear him talk about matches, what his plan was and what he wanted to do. I heard John McEnroe saying on the air too that I guess in Laver Cup there have been times when Patrick and John have wanted to advise him, and he's basically said, no, this is how I'm going to play it. he knows what he wants to do, and I think that's great. I think he's gotten a lot of help from Michael Russell and Paul Annacone. The coaching has been great too, but he himself seems to have pretty good instincts on the court and knows what he has to do. So, and he's a big guy with a big game, with a terrific serve, and I like his backhand. I think he's faster than he was, and he could come in a bit more. He could volley more. He doesn't trust his volley that much yet, but that's something I think he can fix or advance in the weeks and months ahead. And I'll be interested to see him in the majors, because let's face it, he did start off the year. He had a good Wimbledon, disappointing loss in the quarters to Musetti, but a good Wimbledon, but good Australia too, where he got to the quarters and played one of his better matches against Djokovic, and he fended off 15 break points before Novak finally got him and broke him and won. Djokovic won it in 4, but it was a different kind of performance from Fritz than we'd seen in some of the other matches against Djokovic, and a sign of things to come. So I think he'll be in the latter stages of some majors next year. As I say, I'm not convinced that he's going to win one, but I think he's going to give himself some chances.
Yeah, I was impressed with Taylor, and it's interesting you talk about him coming forward more and wanting him to come and actually be a bit braver coming to the net. And we don't tend to associate that with him, and he at times looks a bit uncomfortable, but in that third set against Sinner in the final, I think he came to net 15 times and won 12 of those points. And that was very interesting, because in the first 2 sets, he'd only come forward 3 or 4 times, I think, in each of those sets. And he then changed tact and changed game plan. Then he ended up being 5-4 up in that set. So clearly shows that he does have the potential to come forward more and add it to his game. So something for him to work on. But I was really impressed with him generally as well. And when I talked to him at Wimbledon as press, and I asked him a few questions after his loss, after a couple of wins as well, and I was quite surprised. And maybe it's just because when I listen to him and watch him, and it's not in person, it comes across differently. But I thought he was very mature in the way that he speaks. He clearly seems very intelligent, and as you said, he's a realist. So after the US Open loss, one of the things that stood out to me the most is that they asked him about TFO's comment on the fact that there was no big 3, player to play against in the latter stages of this tournament. And TFO said, it's an easier route, this tournament, and going forward, it could be easier routes for Grand Slam semis and finals. And Fritz admitted and said, look, I have played well, but yeah, I have to admit, it's been a lot easier given I didn't have to play Carlos or Novak on the way to the final. And of course, I played some good players, and you could argue that his route was the hardest given there was no Novak and Carlos, because he still had to play Zverev, Ruud, Berrettini. So there's some good players in there. It wasn't an extremely easy draw, but it also was a draw where he could avoid them. And we know his record against Novak and Carlos is obviously no easy out. So he had a good chance to make the final, and he was very realistic in the press conference. And to hear him say that, I don't think I played my best, I think is maybe a way of him giving himself motivation to say, look, I can push beyond this, and I can, as you say, give himself more opportunities in the future. But it will be interesting to see. He's got a good stretch now of hard court tennis up until and including obviously the Australian Open. So this is a really good time for him to push on and use that momentum, I think. I feel like if he had the run at the Australian Open, obviously there's some hard court tournaments, but then you hit the French Open and it all changes. So I feel like he's got quite a long stretch now on the hard courts to really push on. So I'm excited to see what he can do and potentially add to his game. But very impressed, I think, with his mental aptitude more than anything, actually, in this tournament.
Yeah, no, it was impressive. No, I mean, as far as the draw, Tiafoe was the one who got Tiafoe was the more fortunate one. Tiafoe was going to have to come off Shelton in 5 sets and play Djokovic, and it didn't happen because Novak lost to Popper, and that was a big, big break for Tiafoe. Taylor at least had to go through Ruud. He had to go through Zverev. Those were good wins. And I mean, Ruud's been in the finals here. Zverev, we've talked about. Those were good wins, and so I don't feel like he got that. Yes, he didn't have. Carlos and Novak are in their own league, but he had to deal with I feel like his draw was a good deal tougher than Tiafoe's. So I give him credit for that. As far as the comments you made about him coming in a lot more in the third set against Sinner, a lot of that I thought was, I'm down. I really got to go for it now. And he was playing up the crowd. And he sort of forced himself to do it because of the score in the situation. And that was wise. Now he needs to do that more in normal times too, not just wait until he's on the brink or his back is to the wall, and do it. Start doing it earlier in the match. And also don't worry if you miss a few volleys here and there. And he's going to. Just keep coming forward. Make it more of a habit.
Yeah, 100%. On some of the other players then, like Tsitsipas, and we talked about Zverev, of course, and Rublev, that generation, Steve, how much harder is it going to get for them? Because obviously the big three have now are shifting, and Novak's still there, but we know Rafa's very close towards the end. We don't know when he's going to retire. It potentially could be this year. Obviously, Federer's no longer there, and it looks like going forward, this type of US Open that we've had just now, in terms of the draw, it could become more frequent at the Australian Open onwards next year, with there not being a member of the big three in the final. And potentially, you might have to play Jannik or Carlos in a semi-final, but if one of them loses early, then that half of the draw's opened up big time, like it did at the US Open. So the now gen, as I guess people like to call them, is the boat starting to move away for them? Have they almost missed the boat a little bit? Your Rublevs, Tsitsipas's and Ruud's as well. Obviously, Medvedev's won one. But these players, how worried should they be about the other guys coming through now? Because there's some really young and hungry players coming through that are starting to develop, and they're playing fearless tennis. And these guys tend to, they seem to have a bit of the scar tissue from the big three era, you find.
Yeah, I think they should be very worried. I mean, Tsitsipas is, I guess he's going to push hard and try to get to Turin again and try to end the year well. And maybe he can do it and maybe he won't. He's in danger of potentially not finishing in the top 10 of the world, which would be a sad development for him. He's at a crossroads. Medvedev in his own way Medvedev has not won a tournament since Rome of 23. It's a long stretch for him, long drought. Granted, we saw that the U.S. Open final last year he made and beat Carlos to get there. It was so close in Australia this year, but that's not a big consolation for somebody that's already won one of these and who hasn't been able to make up for it elsewhere and grab a 1,000 somewhere and start building confidence. And a bit unlucky that he had to play Sinner in the quarters because he played pretty well to get to the quarters of the Open, but that's just how it is. You've got to rock. He knew also that if he could beat Sinner and treat that like a final, and I think he tried to, then he's would have been the favorite to win the tournament himself. So I don't know. All those guys, Ruud. No, I think Ruud. We've seen the best of Ruud. I don't think we're going to see him disappear, and I think he could spend plenty of time between 7 and 10 in the world, or maybe it's between 5 and 15 in the world. I don't know. But I don't think we're going to see him. Here's a guy that got to the finals of the U.S. Open 2 years ago, lost to Carlos, lost to Novak in the finals of the French after losing to Rafa in the finals of the French the year before. So 3 finals, 2 in Paris, 1 in the U.S. Open. I don't expect to see that again from him, but he's a real pro. But the notion that he would get a major somewhere on the line, I don't see it. So, yeah, I think all of those guys have reason to worry. You make a good point. If Carlos or Sinner happens to fall early, they get hurt early in a major, and suddenly the draw can open up. But these guys also know, and we're seeing it, Medvedev is losing to a wider cast of players now. The de Minaurs, there's guys that can beat him. He can't take anything for granted. Sasha can lose to those players. We've talked about him losing to Taylor in the last 2 majors. So they have plenty to be worried about. But I don't think they should be discouraged either, because they saw in New York that you can't know how things are going to unfold. That was not what anybody expected from Carlos, one of his worst performances at a major. I don't think he'll replicate it. I don't see it being replicated, but you never know. And the bottom line is, if I'm any of the guys you mentioned, I am worried because of the fact that most likely Carlos and Sinner are going to be they aren't going to have too many letdowns at majors. They're going to keep peaking at majors. They're going to play a lot of finals against each other. And then just the fact that there's other guys in that range of 5 to 12 in the world that, or even a bit deeper, that could beat them on any given day too. So, I honestly think these are things that Medvedev is a very thoughtful guy. I think he's thought about these things. And maybe that's what's going through Sasha's mind too. They know, and they got a couple of guys in their early 20s, and they're advancing to their late 20s, and it's just simply not going to get any easier.
Yeah, it really isn't, I don't think. And that's going to be the interesting thing going forward. How surprised were you, Steve, with Novak and Carlos going out early? Obviously, they have had a really long season, especially Carlos as well. And Novak played the Wimbledon final like Carlos, and they went into the Olympics, played the final there. So they played a lot in quick succession, went from grass to clay to hard court very quickly.
Yeah.
First of all, how hard is that transition, and what was the general feeling, I guess, in the media and at the US Open after the losses as well?
I think it's very tough because it starts with the clay prior to Wimbledon going, then Wimbledon grass, then back to clay, and then over to hard. That's very difficult. On the other hand, they're two great players. They can do it. It's just that it's in such a short time span. Roland Garros, in Novak's case, he's dealing with the knee, and he doesn't like to go on and on about whatever pain he might be experiencing. I suspect he's had to deal with more pain than he's telling us about, and he has no reason to want to announce it. But I think what happened in New York is that Djokovic, I think he really hoped he could find that inspiration, that he would take the Olympic win and be loose and enjoy himself and find some great tennis. His serve went way off on him. He lost the rhythm. Something was off on the toss. He just never served well. He had 14 double faults in his loss to Poprin, which hadn't done since 2010 at a major. And so you have that was an issue, and you could just see that he couldn't quite rouse himself. He didn't have that usual spark that would pull him. For instance, when he lost to Jera, when he beat Jera last year, from 2 sets down at the 23 Open, you could see him. Yeah, he was listless for 2 sets, but then once he started his comeback, you could feel it. It was almost palpable that he was going to turn this around, and he was going to urge himself on, and physically, mentally, emotionally, he was going to be there. And it was like, there's no way I'm losing this match. He was much more conflicted with his emotions in this match against Poprin, and he was trying to talk himself into something that I guess wasn't possible on that night. It's just too soon at the Olympics. Understandable, I guess, in a way. Could have used a few more weeks. And I just don't buy into the idea that Poprin, sure, he took him to 4 in 2 previous majors, but it really, that usually is all that Djokovic would need to say, okay, I'm treating this like this is going to be like a big semifinal, not a third round match. I respect this guy. And he did. He couldn't find it. I do think that was a bit more understandable. Poprin being a seed and having won a Masters 1000 this summer is a bit different than the Dutchman knocking off Alcaraz, because that was a 1-5-4 match. And Carlos really, despite breaking back in the second and third sets and making it more competitive than the first, he was just at sea that match. And but again, he was depressed about losing the Olympics. Probably shouldn't have played Cincinnati. Went to Cincinnati, lost to Monfils. He needs to clear his head. But it's interesting. We've seen it's different. Djokovic is a different mental animal than Carlos. But Carlos, we saw last year when he lost to Djokovic in Cincinnati in the epic following Wimbledon, nearly 4 hours and tiebreaker in the third, and that sent him into a tailspin. And he lost to Medvedev at the Open, which was surprising, and then had a bad fall. And although he got to the semis in Turin, he just didn't finish the year well. And, he didn't win a tournament all the way from Wimbledon of 23 up to Indian Wells of this year. So we see what can happen to him when he's a bit more down on himself. And I think he tends to be very self-critical, very demanding, almost too critical of himself, expecting too much of himself. So I don't know. I hope this time that he clears his head sooner and tries to see if he can pick something up in the fall and at least play better in the fall than he did last fall. He'll come out of it, though. We know how great he is. But to get back to your original point, the guys that did well in the Olympics, it was just too much for them for Carlos, and in the bookends there, Carlos, because he was depressed about losing such a great match to Djokovic in Paris, and Djokovic because he was trying to to find he was so fulfilled by winning that gold medal. Absolute fulfillment after a career long not winning them. That was the only thing missing from his glittering collection. So understandable in both cases. Throwing the Olympics into the middle of the summer it's tough. And at least if it only could have at least been on hard courts, that would have helped. But having them training on the clay and then putting those couple of weeks into the clay and back at Roland Garros and then turn around a few weeks later and play in New York was just asking too much of both of them.
Yeah, it was definitely interesting to see. And I think Carlos tends to go through waves, I think, when he has these types of really big... And I think we have to remember he's very young still, so it's probably understandable. And
well, he's young. He's young in some ways, and he's incredible. And the immaturity does show. You're right. And then there are other times when you say he can't possibly be 21. I mean, he just does not act like one. There's still a surprising maturity, and then he shows us periodically. He shows some immaturity, and you realize that's when you suddenly realize he's acting more like his age. But there are other times, and the way that he worked his way out of 2-1 down against Sinner and Zverev back to back in Roland Garros, to me, was very impressive. And the struggles he had at Wimbledon, including the Tiafoe 5-setter, and then playing his absolute best against a slightly off-form Djokovic in the final. Again, you look at that. He was trying to defend the Wimbledon title and beat Djokovic 2 years in a row. He thought he'd feel something more pressure than he did. He didn't show it at all. He looked like a 28-year-old in that match. So poised. So you're right. There are times that we see it. It fluctuates with him. The mature, composed, confident Alcaraz versus the Alcaraz on the other end of the scales.
Yeah. No, I agree. And lastly, on the men's side, Steve, I mean, were there any surprise packages for you in the tournament? Players that stood out and you were maybe surprised performed as well as they did?
It's a good question. I mean, Draper, obviously, you have to say, I didn't see Draper making the semis. As much as I'm impressed by him and we've been seeing the steady improvement, I didn't think he was going to be quite as good as he was. He really took apart de Minaur and played quite well despite being sick and obviously in stress and discomfort against Sinner in the semis. Those first two sets are 5 and 6. He broke back in the first set from 4-3 down, got it back to 5-all and lost a long game on his serve, and that was the set. And then somehow made it into a tiebreak in the second, despite a lot of struggles on his serve. And I think there were 3 games he was down break points, and he kept bailing himself out. I thought it was. I think he's ready to come to the forefront of the game. I think he's going to be. He's going to be a solid top 10 player. He's going to be pushing toward the top 5 in the next year. And so he did surprise me. He definitely surprised me. I thought maybe 16s or quarters. I didn't expect to see him in the semifinals of a major, and good for him. He's got a great temperament, a lot of drive, and that lefty serve is really devilish.
Yeah, it is. I actually talked to his junior coach, who coached him up until 17, 18, up until he made it onto the main tour. And he thinks that, he's probably a bit biased, but he thinks that he could win a slam and could potentially even be world number 1. I mean, where do you see him in terms of his potential, Steve? How far do you think he can actually go?
Yes, I'm sorry for interrupting. No, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I don't think he's going to be number 1 next year, but I think next year, I wouldn't be shocked if he won Wimbledon. Wouldn't be shocked. And I certainly wouldn't be shocked if in say 2 years he's right in there. I mean, that he's say the 3rd best player in the world behind Sinner and Alcaraz and pushing them, because he's so. That forehand has got. It was a chance to watch him up close in a way that I'd never been able to do before this Open, and I was very impressed with the amount of work on that. That forehand is just, there's so much heavy top, but it's penetrating too, and the backhand is flatter but very consistent. And you couple that with and his willingness to go in. He knows how to volley, and I just feel like. He's got a combination of serves in the deuce court that are very effective, and he's got a tremendous slice serve out wide in the ad court that gave everybody nightmares at the Open, including Sinner. So I feel like, yeah, he has the kind of game, and I think he definitely benefits. There's no question he benefits from being a lefty, and a very aggressive lefty at that. So, yeah, I mean, I think next year there's no way he's not going to finish top 10 in the world next year. And I think I wouldn't be a bit shocked if he ended 2024 somewhere about 5 in the world. And then the next year is where I expect him to make his move. I would say 25 advancement, maybe a major, maybe not. But by 26, I think he's going to be knocking on that door and probably grabbing one of the big prizes somewhere. Most likely play Wimbledon or the Open. Let's put it that way. I don't think it'll be the French and maybe not the Australian, but those last 2 majors are where he can make his mark.
Well, us Brits will be really happy if he does win a slam as soon as you say, Steve. So let's hope for that. That would be fantastic to see. He's definitely been given a lot of airtime here in the UK.
And don't get me wrong, by the way. I'm not suggesting that he's going to become the dominant force, but he's going to be one of the top players, because I expect that Sinner and Alcaraz will have back and forth. They're going to end up having a lock on 1 and 2 in the world for quite a long time. But I think Draper is going to be the guy that at some point is right behind them. He's there, and I say this is a couple of years off, but I think by then, I like his whole outlook. He's got a sort of a hard edge to him, and he seems very determined and pretty sure of himself. He knows what he can do out there, and he knows how good he could get. So I'm encouraged, but again, it takes time. It's a matter of advancing next year and at least replicate the semi at the Open somewhere at the majors, get at least a semi and maybe break into a final, and then set the stage for 2026, because by then I think he's going to be a lot better.
Well, let's see, Steve. I'm excited. You're getting me excited for it. In terms of other players then, because you said about Draper being just below Alcaraz and Rune, and actually this last question on the men's, for others like Rune and Shelton, do you see them in that same category, or do you see them in a different category? Like who do you think are going to be the ones just below?
Yeah, Shelton, I think has had a good year. And he happened to lose a really hard-fought 5-setter to Tiafoe at the Open. It was going to always be hard to get back to the semis of the Open again without the right draw. He didn't have the right draw, and he had a very tough draw. And because playing Francis in New York is different from playing him anywhere else, at least the Tiafoe thus far that we've seen. But I do feel like over the year he improved a lot, and he's another guy. I mean, I see him heading toward the top 10, and I'm not quite sure. I maybe my hopes at this point. Maybe I'm a little more encouraged about in terms of the immediate future, looking say 3 years down the road for Draper. But I do see Shelton being a top 10 player for sure. Where he goes from there, I'm not sure. I still want to see some improvements in his ground game. His forehand, to me, looks much better than it was a year ago. I like that. Now I just want to see more improvement in the backhand and a little better fitness. I thought that Francis really exposed that a bit. He really wore him down in those 4th and 5th sets, and you could see it and feel it coming. But again, I think he's very professional. He's going to keep working hard. Rune, I mean, who can possibly figure out Holger Rune? He's enigmatic. He's got a lot of ability. We've seen him play tremendous matches against Djokovic, even beat him in the Paris indoor event a couple of years ago in the finals, 7-5 in the 3rd. I mean, other really close matches with Novak. I don't know. This year, obviously, compared to last year, he spent most of the 23, the second part, until late in the fall. There was a period of months where he was hurt a lot and doing nothing. He started a resurgence in the fall last year, brought Becker in. Too many coaching changes. Mouratoglou in, out, in. I feel like he's a great tennis player. And I felt like if he could have beaten Tiafoe in Cincinnati, that would have really helped him a lot to be in the final in Cincinnati. He had the match point, and Francis hit a forehand inside in that crawled over the net court and landed in. That was kind of lucky for Tiafoe. And so Rune could have been playing Sinner in the final. Frankly, I think he would have played a much closer match with Sinner than Tiafoe did, who had one close set and then went down pretty decisively in the second set. So, Yeah, disappointing. He got destroyed at the Open by Nakashima. I watched that match. He was just comprehensively beaten from the backcourt and looked a bit frantic, looking at his corner. I don't know. I still feel long term he could become the great player that we always hoped he would be. But this has not played out the way I thought it would after the first half of 2023. The results haven't been in there. The physical health hasn't been there. And therefore, his game has not advanced the way I thought it would. He can serve big, but he doesn't serve consistently well. There seem to still be a few holes in his game. And, then he can give a performance too, like he did against Djokovic at Wimbledon this year, where Djokovic just thoroughly exposed him and made him look pretty bad. So I'm worried about him. Let's put it that way. I'm worried about Rune, not about Shelton. Shelton, I think, is going to we're going to see more improvement from him next year for sure. And I also think Shelton will get better. We'll see improvement on clay, and he'll learn how to play on grass a bit better and add that to his hard court credentials and start pushing his ranking up into the top 10 as well. Again, I would expect Shelton ends next year somewhere between 8 and 10 in the world.
Well, yeah, Rune, I'm also equally as worried about. I think the way he talks is generally quite good to hear, but it's just not translating onto court. And then also, as you said, the coaching changes, I think, are pretty worrying as well. He needs some stability and needs a clean bill of health for a long period of time, I think, is the key. And just focus on playing a specific way. Shelton is interesting that you say on grass, because I think he could be really good on grass. I think his game should be, and once he figures out how to move on it effectively, I mean, his serve, and he's got really good hands in the net as well. He likes coming forward. I know nowadays grass is not all about serve and volley because of how the court's slowed down, but there is still an advantage to it. And I think he's got the skill set to be really successful on grass as well, I think.
Yeah, he does. I feel like Draper at this point, oddly, Draper gets more out of his left-handed serve than Shelton does. Even though we know Shelton can reach higher speeds and go into the 140s, he still hasn't figured out entirely how to take full advantage of it. He doesn't use that slice serve wide as consistently well in the ad court as Draper does. But again, I think that's going to come. And where I think that Shelton is enhanced tremendously is by his father. So many of the fathers are overbearing, and you almost want them to get out of the way of their kids. I don't feel that way about his father at all. He's only encouraging him. He's like a cheerleader, but a cheerleader who offers the best possible advice and encouragement. So I feel like he will continue to get better with his dad's help. And he's got a great attitude. And you're right, potentially on grass, he can become a great grass court player. And he'll improve on clay. And so, but I feel like next year, he'll kind of start anew. This year, he wanted to protect what he did in a way. When we got to the summer, he's always thinking about that semifinal run he had. But now that's all behind him. And he can just forget about all that. He's established himself now. And he's established himself as a top 15 player. Now the trick is to crack that top 10. And I think next year it will definitely happen. I think the results are going to be much more consistent for Shelton than they were in 2024.
Yeah. No, I'm interested to see his development for sure. And I agree with the sentiment on his serve and not necessarily using his leftiness to the full potential. I feel like Draper definitely uses that better at the moment. I feel like Shelton knows that he can serve up to certain speeds, and he thinks he can almost serve through people at times. Maybe needs a bit more tact, but he'll get there. He's so young and clearly a great competitor as well. Steve, I wanted to ask you actually, because obviously I saw you at Wimbledon and you're at the US Open and you've been to plenty of Grand Slams. What's your favorite Grand Slam? What's been your favorite Grand Slam and why? Which one do you most enjoy going to travel to?
Wimbledon. I mean, I loved Australia. I was only able to get so far to a couple of Australian in 16 and 17, but I've been to over 40 French and more than 50 Wimbledons and over 50 Opens. Wimbledon is my favorite because I think it's the best run, and because I feel like the general sports public is paying more attention to Wimbledon than they are to any other major. And it's just so elegant and so perfectly presented by the organizers, and sticking to the essentially all white rule, and it's regal. It's regal, and I think again that center court. I think of golf. Golf has always had these beautiful settings for their majors with 4 days and these beautiful courses and all the greenery. And Wimbledon comes the closest to matching that as well, being on the grass. And I just think there's a certain splendor to it that none of the other majors can quite match. And there's a reason why it's the preeminent tournament in tennis. So that's my favorite by far.
Yeah, well, hopefully I can experience the others, but it's great that you enjoy Wimbledon as well. Steve, is there anything else you want to touch on before we wrap it up?
No, just briefly. I loved the women's final because I thought that Pegula gave herself a chance. She had a terrific fortnight. She beat Swiatek. She came back brilliantly from a set 2-love, almost 3-love and 2 breaks against Mukova in the semis, and one wondered, could she contain Sabalenka in the final? She did. She did a great job. She came back from 5-2 down in the first set, made it 5-all, and then lost a couple of long, hard-fought games in a row to drop the set at 7-5, and then comes from love 3 and break point down in the second to win 5 games in a row and almost sealed that second set before Sabalenka showed her class as she had in the semis when she beat Navarro. When she was in danger late in the second set of both matches is when she produced. In the Navarro case, it was the 5-6 deuce ace and then the tiebreak. And in the case of Pegula, it was running off 4 straight games from 3-5 down to avoid a third set and avoid a crowd that would have been just vociferous and inspired and urging Jess on and urging her on her every move. So I really enjoyed that. The tail end of the women's event and Pegula's performance and Sabalenka's and the tournament overall. Had a great time.
Yeah, I think the WTA tour generally is just so exciting. There's so many players that can be other players, and I feel like there's an established cohort at the top, but there's still the up-and-comers and also players who've won slams in the past, and you're always thinking, can they make that run again? Like your Andreescu's and your Fernandez and your Kennins and Raducanu's, those young Ostapenko, can they win another major again? Can they go on? And they're always dangerous. And Osaka's come back. So I felt the women's tour is always fantastic. And I think next time we'll definitely spend some time talking about the women's tour in depth as well. I don't want to rush it. But yeah, Steve, thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate you coming on and having a chat. And we should definitely chat again soon as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Just a brief comment about Osaka, because you mentioned there was another match where she had a triple set point. This time a triple set point lead. Should have been in a 3-setter against Mukova and wasn't able to do it. And I feel sorry for her. It's like she's forgotten how to win. She's got this little Sharapova routine. She turns around, peps herself up between points, goes back and serves. Her attitude is great. It's so positive, but she's not winning. And it goes back to the Swiatek match at the French where she had a match point and nearly pulled off a highly unexpected triumph. And I feel like she's playing almost as well as she was, and she's just hasn't been able to get the win. She did beat Ostapenko at the Open. I saw that match. She played very well. So I hope that she can turn the corner soon. I'd like to see Osaka back in the mix and back in the top 5, and I hope gradually she can get there between maybe a few good tournaments this fall and then a good start to next year. Because there's been a lot of winnable matches that she has not been able to convert her lead. So I hope that happens. But listen, this has been fun, and I look forward to coming on again.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you so much. And guys, if you haven't already, do hit that like button, subscribe if you're new. And also, Steve also has his own podcast each week as well. So go check out that. It's on YouTube and podcast platforms as well. Thank you, guys. Have a good one.